This video is sponsored by Nerd Monkeys. More on them a bit later in the video. Sometimes in game development, it's difficult to know whether you should relentlessly push on with getting your game to the point where it's fully playable from start to finish, or spend time iterating and polishing as you go along, especially if it's just you working by yourself. Normally I try sticking to the former, trudging forwards to a figurative endpoint, but recently something happened that inspired me to hit the pause button on that forward momentum and to make some pretty big changes to my game's UI. And in this video, I'd love to show you what I've done. Welcome back to the Point and Click Devlog, an ongoing series in which sweeping, long-lasting gameplay changes can pretty much be decided upon like that. So a few weeks ago, I was scrolling through Twitter and I realised that I'd been quite a bad member of the game dev community. I go on Twitter and I make posts every now and again about my own progress. I retweet fellow devs making great looking adventure games, and occasionally I back projects on Kickstarter. But I realised that I hadn't actually played any of the games being made by my peers, and in fact I hadn't actually played a point and click game in quite a long while. I think a big reason for this is that I've never really been much of a desk gamer. I am a couch-based console casual at heart. And more often than not, when I finish working for the day, I just want to switch my brain off, and that normally means shooting stuff or running around big open worlds. But the downside of that is that I've been unsupportive to people who are making games that I've been telling other people on Twitter to buy. Even games from people in this channel's community Discord server. And that makes me a massive hypocrite for one, but also kind of a vacuous friend, I guess. So yeah, I had this realisation and I went on Steam and I wishlisted a bunch of upcoming stuff, and I basically bought everything I could that was already released and available on Mac. And now I am working through that backlog. And you know what? It turns out that playing games like the one you're trying to make can be quite inspiring and helpful. Who knew? So one of the first games I played, because I really liked its vibe, was Voodoo Detective. It's a great game, by the way. Fun, cosy mystery, lovely soundtrack, and really great voice acting. But I was also struck by the slickness of its UI design, and specifically by two things in particular. Firstly, everything was one click, rather than having separate inspect, use and speak options. And secondly, even though I played on Mac, the inventory and general user interface had all clearly been designed to work just as well with a finger on mobile. So aside from giving me a bit of extra inspiration in broad game dev terms, it also got me thinking about the UI in my game and whether things were overly complicated just for the sake of tradition. I know that among die-hard fans of the genre, there are quite massively differing views on this stuff. I also know many great looking games that are either out or coming out with LucasArts style verb lists, for instance. And over the years I have played and enjoyed point and click games with a bunch of different UI systems. But suffice it to say, I guess Voodoo Detective got me thinking. Up until now my game has had a click first, choose interaction second way of doing things, where you'd click on a hotspot and two icons would appear, inspect and use, or inspect and talk. And that's been fine, but I never really knew how I would eventually present those icons. I've had these placeholder ones here for ages, but never really settled on a good solution for their look and feel. So look, I'm not here to say that any one system is better than any other, but what I can say is that playing Voodoo Detective acted as a bit of a light bulb moment. For my game, I realised that everything being single click would be fine, and perhaps more to the point, it might be more streamlined and feel more modern. And it would have other pros too. It would make porting to mobile much easier for one, but it would also speed up development, because with my pre-existing UI choices, I'd been making every hotspot have a use and an inspect interaction. But often the use one would be some variation of, oh, I don't need one of those, or if it was an object that you do use or pick up, then the inspect interaction would often just bluntly say what it was, unless I had found a particular way to be funny with it. And there's a lot of redundancy in that. So removing those redundant interactions would help me put my remaining scenes together quicker, because it would effectively half the workload for each hotspot. but it will also eventually reduce dialogue for my main character, which is going to save me a lot of money in voiceover terms. So yeah, I set about changing stuff, and weirdly, making this change was really straightforward. In the settings panel of Adventure Creator, there's an option to change the interaction style. If you change it to single click, it just defaults to whichever interaction is first in this list. And as it happens, I seem to have accidentally built things out in such a way where the core interaction for any one thing, for example use, if it's a thing you pick up, was the one that I wrote first across pretty much the whole game. Which ultimately means that aside from having to sort out one or two things, the game just switched by itself without me having to do anything. So far so good, but now I had a bee in my bonnet about UI and I wanted to do more. I suddenly had a desire to add more polish and to make things look a little bit better for whenever I share updates, make Twitter posts, or just when I'm testing the game for myself. So that's exactly what I did next, and that is a process that I will share after this quick word from today's video sponsor. Nerd Monkeys is a publisher who prides itself on working with interesting up-and-coming indie developers with a focus on handling game porting for major consoles. Most recently, the Nerd Monkeys team worked with Portugal-based studio Infinity Games to publish Railways Train Simulator on the Nintendo Switch eShop, an addictive real-time puzzle strategy title that is well worth your time. And today, the Nerd Monkeys guys are kindly sponsoring this very video in an effort to reach out to other indie devs who want to get their game published on home consoles. If you're interested in finding out how that works, who the team are, and how you can get involved, click the link in the description below, and thanks very much to Nerd Monkeys for their continued support here on the Point and Click Devlog. Okay, back to the video. So now fully on a quest to make things look good, the next decision I made was to change the way the text appears when you mouse over a hotspot, from hovering near the cursor to occupying a uniform space at the top of the screen. I found this free paper texture for that from unsplash.com, cut it out into a very rough rectangle, added a coffee stain PNG, and then just changed the hotspot settings in the AC menu. The font I'm now using for everything across the game, by the way, is called Big Boy, which I think is a really fun, chunky, but easy to read font that was created by Robert Thompson. And Robert has kindly made it free for people to use in their commercial projects. His Devlog series is so much better than this one, by the way. I really recommend you check that out, and I will put a link to it in the description below. Anyway, with that sorted, the next things that grabbed my attention were the inventory and the pause menu. And as we all know, inventories in point and click games are pretty big deals. By default, Adventure Creator's inventory looks like this. You hover over it with your mouse and it opens up, and it's laid out in a straight line. It's simple but a bit basic, and at some point in the past I decided to mess about with a bit of a half-assed replacement. So I made this bag and this kind of leathery texture that pops out with your stuff on it. And that was fine for the time being, but I don't think it was ever going to be permanent. For one thing, there's only space on this line for so many items, and the behaviour of the slider buttons at either end always felt a bit counterintuitive to me. Like if you wanted to combine an item from the front of the inventory with one that's not yet visible, you more or less couldn't. You know, also I want to one day release this game on iOS because, and I don't say this lightly, the iPad is the very best point and click adventure game machine there is. So I knew that this had to change at some point. Pause menu, meanwhile, has always been the stock Adventure Creator one, and that made me sad because, I mean, just look at it. So I opened up Pixelmator, which is my go-to Photoshop clone these days, and started mucking around with shapes and designs. For the inventory, I knew I wanted a big grid of items so that you could see all of them at once, and I figured that that could slide out from the left and fill a good chunk of the screen, leaving some space to click outside of it to close it back up again. So the first thing I did was to do some research on game UI best practices. I read some white papers on shape dimensions that the human eye finds pleasing, and then I had a look through Unity documentation to figure out the optimum size an inventory could be without harming game performance in any way. Yeah, no, obviously not. What I did was just draw a completely arbitrarily sized box based on nothing at all, and then pretty much just stuck with that for the rest of the whole process. I painted that box a completely random shade of blue, added a background texture, and then laid out my inventory slots, leaving a space for this inspect button, which we'll come onto in a minute. I figured that what with the whole game taking place in an office building, adding a little tab on the side might be nice to make it feel, you know, like a folder, and that I could make another tab for something else behind it. And to that end, you might also notice the to-do list tab, and we'll get onto that in a minute as well. In Adventure Creator, every menu is handled, unsurprisingly, by the menu section in the AC panel. And much like a lot of game development, that can seem like a scary place when you first poke around in it. But if you just spend a bit of time looking at how the pre-existing stuff has been put together and then messing around with sizes and shapes and buttons, you'll probably find, like I did, that it is actually a really powerful but impressively straightforward tool. So for my new inventory, it was just a case of importing this big screen-sized graphic, telling AC that I wanted it to slide out from the left, and then adjusting the inventory box part of the menu so that the grid of the inventory items matched up with the design that I'd drawn. With my ultimate aim being to also release this game on mobile, I knew I wanted all this to be as one touch as possible, which meant selecting items with a click rather than dragging them, and then being able to select an item and tap outside the inventory to close it. For the former, it's just a case of choosing the associated interaction style in the inventory section of AC's settings, and for the latter, you just want to create some big blank buttons that, when you click them, run an action list to close the inventory. It's really simple. With no right click on mobile, I decided to create an area inside the inventory to drop items onto to inspect them, and I've got to say I'm pretty pleased with my ingenuity here. So what this is basically an inventory item. Specifically, it's an inventory item called Inspect that has a blank graphic. AC lets you create different inventory grids within the overarching inventory menu for different categories. So I've just made a new category for that item called Inspect and given it a single 1x1 grid, which is here. I appreciate that might sound really confusing, but the basic result is that when you drop an item into that inspect area, the game is effectively doing combine X item with the inspect item, and then just running the associated action list. If you make that action list be the character talking about that first item, then it seems to the player like you've inspected it. You can even do that the other way around if you like, so yeah, jobs are good in there. So then yeah, there's also this to-do list, which is basically just another menu that's triggered by a button within the inventory. I haven't finished this yet, and in fact I think it will be something that I sort out nearer the end of my game's development as a whole. But the general methodology here, I think, will just be to create separate graphics for each of the list items and for the checks in the checkboxes, and then just tell AC to show those graphics once you've done a certain thing or spoken to a certain person. So it should be easy, just a little bit time consuming to set up. You could very well argue that my tabbed design has resulted in me making more work for myself, but I like the idea of having a to-do list in a game like this. That's mainly because in Act 2 there are several big tasks that the player can do in any order, and I don't want things to become overwhelming. But it's also because, you know, sometimes you might take a bit of a break from playing a game for a while, and then when you come back you'll have no idea what you're supposed to be doing, so I think to-do lists are a nice touch. The pause, settings, save and load menus were actually pretty easy. It was just a case of taking the design language from the inventory and creating something that could replace the basic graphics that are already built into AC, because by default everything like saving and loading and stuff works right out of the box. And then lastly, I wanted to create some simple unified icons to open those menus. So I went with a folder icon for the inventory and then the classic cog icon for pause. And I created a state that's just normal for them and one where you mouse over it that's slightly rotated to give you a bit of feedback on your hover. And yeah, this is the end result of all that tinkering, with, I think, everything now feeling a bit more polished and uniform. So I don't know if what I should be saying is that I played Voodoo Detective and then pretty much stole everything it was doing in terms of UI, but yeah, I basically played Voodoo Detective and then pretty much stole everything it was doing in terms of UI. I guess you could make a point of saying that this kind of stuff could and perhaps should be done much later down the line, and that I could have used this time to get my game, you know, further towards a more fully playable state. But I do think every now and again doing this kind of thing can give you a shot in the arm in terms of inspiration. Like when I do test this stuff out, my game now feels more like a game because it has all these uniform UI assets, and if nothing else, that just feels nice for me as the guy who has to stare at it all day long. So yeah, new UI, new you, or new me, anyway. I'd be keen to hear what you think of all this in the comments, as well as, you know, what's your take on the single click, verb list, verb coin, UI style discussion. You know, as long as you're not mean about it to each other. Also, this video is already really long, but before I go, I should probably just say blah blah blah, Patreon, blah blah blah, Discord, blah blah blah, 5,000 subscribers, and I hope that you know what I mean. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, liking, subscribing, and being a nice person. Maybe I'll see you in our community Discord server, but no worries if not. Hopefully you'll come back and watch another video in future either way. Bye.